Everyone can hear all right in the back? We have new sound system, a new social hall, a new everything around the synagogue these days. But it's wonderful to look out here and to see those beautiful windows in the back. It really helps us feel the holiness of this area, of this room. Before charging into battle, officers in the Israeli army are known to shout something that runs contrary to all other militaries in the world, something that if things do not go as planned, could endanger the entire command structure around them, and yet still they shout it. They shout, "Acharai," after me. The question is, if it is so dangerous, potentially leaving their subordinates without leadership, why do these officers do this? They do it because it sends a message to everyone around them. I will not ask you to do anything that I would not do first. That your blood is just as sacred as mine. That the fate of our mission lies in each and every one of our hands, and that you matter to me. 50 years ago, on Yom Kippur Day, 1973. How many of you remember that moment? The cry of Acharai resounded for a small battalion of troops and tanks stationed in the closest outpost to Syria in the Golan Heights, Outpost 107. If you've been up to the Golan Heights and you know how crammed it is, you've probably seen a lot of the remnants of this battle. As war broke out that morning, which would be the parallel to Yom Kippur this morning, the soldiers were under heavy fire, destroying most of the outpost positions and even their supply of drinking water. While IDF tanks managed to hold off the enemies, destroying several Syrian tanks, their ammunition was soon exhausted, leaving the 19 remaining troops completely outnumbered and cut off from the rest of the army. Several days later into the war, their rations were dangerously low. Worse yet, they were all that stood in the way of the Syrian tanks having a direct path to Tel Aviv. In the hill above them, there were 110 tanks, a full armored division. Their commanding officer, Eli Melech, radioed for air support. Negative, he was told. Then he radioed for armor support. Negative, he was told. Then he radioed for artillery support. Negative, he was told once more. Ze avud, all is lost, many of the troops said, slumping into their bunkers. One soldier was so desperate, he carved the names of all 19 men on a shell casing as a way that they could be remembered later. Yossi Zadok, a Golani corporal, stood with his bazooka in hand, unsure of how to proceed. He had never been considered a great shot with a bazooka, and making matters worse, he only had a few rounds of ammunition left. Just firing the weapon alone was going to be tricky. To locate a target and fire, Yossi would have to raise his head above the top of the bunker for several seconds, leaving him completely exposed. This was against protocol and perhaps even suicidal. But what choice did he have? Stopping the oncoming Syrian army was an imperative to saving the country. So working with one of his fellow troops, a mortar man by the name of Amos, they devised a plan of action. Amos would put his helmet on top of his rifle and raise it above the top of the bunker for a few seconds to see what the Syrian response would be. If they received fire back, they would move to another spot. If it was clear, Yossi would prepare his bazooka and shoot. Taking a deep breath, the two beleaguered soldiers prayed, and then lifting the helmet, they waited. Nothing. Yossi stood and fired, scoring a direct hit. They did this several more times, each time taking down a tank. When they ran out of bazooka rounds, and this is pretty unbelievable, they used the only thing they had left, phosphorus. If you know what phosphorus, it's not a military weapon. It is really just meant to mark the tank so they could be found out. Amazingly, it worked. It scared another group of Syrians out of their tank, thinking it was on fire. In the end, all 19 troops survived. Yossi was the only one injured, but he thankfully recovered a few months later. And after more than 100 hours trapped inside of a narrow bunker with little food or water, under constant enemy fire, they had managed to survive. And because of the bravery of the troops stationed at Outpost 107, as well as many other Israeli soldiers and leaders, Israel won a war it had no business even surviving. Acharai, they had said to one another, after me. But winning and war are not things that go together very easily. Even though, in the end, Israel had secured positions deep within Egypt and Syria, the Yom Kippur War was considered one of the biggest tragedies of modern Israeli history. Over 11,000 Israelis lost their lives, the most of any war outside of the War of Independence in 1948. And just as importantly, the Yom Kippur War exposed the vulnerability of this small nation by the Mediterranean Sea for both itself and for its enemies. I was born a few weeks after the ceasefire, and thus grew up in the shadow of the Yom Kippur War. Religious school after religious school teacher taught about the tragic nature of the conflict. While war is almost always tragic, this one was all the more so. There were very few Israelis that had not suffered a loss in their own families. Golda Meir, the Israeli prime minister at the time, who was nicknamed the Iron Lady because of her leadership during the war, resigned a few months later, disgraced by the warnings that had not been heeded right before war broke out. Sadness gripped our Jewish homeland, a fact that even the subsequent Camp David Accords hardly lessened. Perhaps this is best epitomized by a song by the Israeli artist David Broza, who I equate with Bruce Springsteen. He's the Bruce Springsteen of Israel. And one of his famous songs in 1977, Yihiyeh Tov Kain. Lifamim ani nishbar, az halayla, o halayla, itach ani nishar. It will be okay, it will be all right. Sometimes I break apart. Thus tonight, I will stay with you. Looking back now, a half a century after the outbreak of the war, the true history of that period is murky. Golda Meir, thankfully, is now viewed as a hero, celebrated in the movie theater with a triumphant performance by Helen Mirren. I don't know if you had a chance to see it. It was in and out of theaters, but probably a number of you did. And while the tanks from the Yom Kippur War still litter the landscape around both the south and the north of Israel, the depression has long since lifted. That time now represents lost opportunity in the peace process with the Palestinians and the beginning of the religious fervor that now grips even the Israeli government. All these years later, the Yom Kippur War teaches us that our reflections change over time, that even the heaviest of defeats can be recast as a triumph, and that the human spirit is resilient. These are insights that are true not only about a historic period in time, but in life in general. Our personal feelings about an experience are malleable, shifting as the world around us changes. The Hebrew phrase that comes to mind is one that the members of our 2023 Israel Civics Leaders Trip heard quite often when we were in Israel this past February. Zeh misubach. It's complicated. This was a phrase we used almost any time we sat down to discuss almost anything. either in the present or past Israeli history. Take for example, the fact that the war was waged on our holiest day, today, on Yom Kippur of all days. This always struck me as intentionally cruel. Pulling soldiers from synagogues, disrupting age-old rituals with military bombardments felt spiteful and even cynical. But in looking back on what actually happened, it turns out it's a lot more complicated. That October, in addition to being the Jewish holiday season, was also the middle of Ramadan. We were not the only ones fasting. Our Muslim neighbors were fasting as well. And having war break out on Yom Kippur actually helped the Israeli military, ensuring the roads would be clear to mobilize troops. In other words, zeh misubak. It's complicated. The phrase works for Yom Kippur itself. Yom Kippur is not an easy holiday to explain or observe. You might have heard this is the day of dread, but it's also called the happiest day of the year. How do these two emotions go together? We reflect and reflect and reflect, often without coming to a definitive understanding about what we did wrong or how we could do things differently if presented with the same situation. Life is not a puzzle just to be solved, but a muddy, murky river whose bottom is difficult to get to the bottom of. On Yom Kippur, we live not in the Acharai, in the charge after me, but in the Acharei, the time after. If Acharai is about pushing forward into battle, Acharei is about looking back after the battle has already been waged and assessing the damage. The Torah readings that we read here in our community on Yom Kippur are from the end of the Torah, from the book of Deuteronomy. This contrasts with the Torah readings from Rosh Hashanah, which are from the beginning in Genesis, when the story has yet to really unfold. Even the traditional reading that most synagogues read from the book of Leviticus comes from the middle of Leviticus in a section called Acharei Mot, after the death of Aaron's two sons. All of us here know full well what it means to live in the aftermath of events. We enter 5784 after the pandemic, sort of, right? After the massacre at Tops, after the blizzard of 22. This is the first Yom Kippur in 4 years that we've not had to significantly plan around COVID. Our lives, for the most part, have reverted to normal, but they, as we must also recognize, are not normal. The toll these past 4 years have taken on us is immense. It has made us more wary of crowds, more on guard against attackers, more fragile than we had felt before, more mortal. All in all, the pandemic pushed more than, this is crazy, 250 million people into poverty, 70 million into extreme poverty. It left 1 billion children out of school for an entire year, and 700 million for a year and a half. The World Bank estimates today that students risk losing $21 trillion in annual income because of COVID-19. It has widened geographic inequalities, decreased trust in governments, worsened health outcomes, changed our labor market, and has left us with a mental health crisis like we've never seen before. Who here has been left unscathed by what we have gone through? Who here has not personally witnessed the effects on our family, friends, and our community? I can tell you, no one. 32 years ago in 1991, a famous Israeli singer named Yair Rosenblum traveled up to Kibbutz Beit Hashita to help with the healing process from the Yom Kippur War. While nearly 2 decades had passed, the members of the kibbutz had not moved on. In 1973, there had been about 500 kibbutzniks in this small community. 11 lost their life, 11 young people, I should say, lost their lives in the war, the highest percentage of any small town in Israel. Beit Hashita, a kibbutz that produces melons and olives, is known for being defiantly secular. Only a short distance from the Valley of Tears, where Yossi and Amir miraculously survived, in Outpost 107, the members of the kibbutz were a cynical bunch, having lost faith not only in God, but in Israel itself. Yom Kippur was approaching, and Rosenblum wanted to bring something that would ease their suffering and restore their faith, not in God, but in life, actually. He turned to the liturgy of Yom Kippur itself. And if you knew this kibbutz, this was shocking. How could you go to the liturgy for this? He recruited the kibbutz's best singer, Hanok Albalek. He organized a choir to sing the holiday's most haunting melody, what we already just sang, the Unatana Toke. The great shofar sounded, a still small voice was heard. The angels are dismayed, they are seized by fear and trembling as they proclaim, behold the day of judgment. So here, traditionally on this kibbutz, they didn't gather in synagogues. They had their own ritual, which probably involved eating even. What happened next was transformative. As one of the kibbutzmans recalled in Matty Friedman's book on Leonard Cohen, Who by Fire, when Hanok began to sing and broke open the gates of heaven, the audience was struck dumb. While they were secular, they knew the words of the prayer. Tears began to stream down their faces. The healing process, after 2 decades, had finally begun. In the Talmudic tractate, Brachot 32b, the rabbis write about the closing of the gates at the end of Yom Kippur. While the gates of prayer shut tight, the rabbis muse, the gates of tears never do. They remain open whenever we need. 8 years ago, I helped lead a group of Buffalonians to Israel, many of whom are in the room today, and many of whom became friends with each other. This was our first, and hopefully not our last, 3 congregational trip. We had Beth Tzedek, Beth Zion, and Shir Shalom. And our first stop on the trip was Yad Lashiron, Israel's official memorial to its armored troops. Not far from the airport, we came there very jet-lagged and exhausted. When you go on an Israel trip, you're exhausted when you get there. Usually you're flying all night, but they tell you, keep going, keep going. Wearily, we climbed in and out of the various tents used in different wars at the entrance to the memorial. Then we gathered by a long black wall marked by names, similar to the Vietnam Memorial in Washington, D.C. It included the word there were the names of every armored soldier who lost their life in any war. The list was organized by each war, and the longest list by far is from the Yom Kippur War. Inside the main building, a computerized database held the pictures of each and every one of these men and women, smiling faces of Israel's youth, the deep price of freedom, and all of them calling out the famous battle cry, Acharai, after me. Here in Yom Kippur, we live in memory of all those who charged ahead. Their stories fold and unfold in our liturgy and in our hearts. We live in the Acharai, after me, beneficiaries of their supreme bravery. But we also live in the Acharei, processing, reevaluating all that has come before. As we look back, may we find empathy and sympathy for both our past decisions and the past decisions of others as well. Let us dig deep inside of ourselves to release the pangs of regret and remorse held in our collective souls. The tears that come, let them serve as a balm, healing the parts of ourselves still unbroken. For as Golda Meir once mused, those who do not know how to weep with their whole heart don't know how to laugh either. May the gates of tears always be open at all times to us and everyone we know. A Gemar Chatima Tova, a writing and a sealing in the book of a life well lived, an easy and meaningful Yom Kippur. We'll take a moment to reflect.